and I'll just start with the learning objectives. So what are the things that we will learn after this presentation? So my focus will be on the preoperative assessment, which is specific to a patient who is requiring pneumonectomy. Then challenges which is posed because of changes in the pathophysiology associated with pneumonectomy, and then approach to anesthetizing a patient for pneumonectomy, like how to conduct a one lung ventilation, what are the various techniques and methodologies by which one can achieve one lung ventilation, and then common complications which we encounter after pneumonectomy surgeries. So 1933, the first pneumonectomy was performed on an obstetrician and gynecologist. He was a doctor and he presented for a lobectomy for lung cancer. But the findings during the surgery were such that the extent of the surgery was increased and he landed into pneumonectomy. But the good thing was that Dr. Gilmore continued to practice medicine for 24 years after this surgery. So that was the first thing. Then why we are so much worried about the pneumonectomies? The important thing is that there is increased risk of perioperative pulmonary complications and long-term respiratory complications following lung resection. That's why there is so much of debate. We can see that 30 days survival is 92% and 1 year survival is 74% after pneumonectomy. Whereas if we go for a limited resection like lobectomy or sleeve resection, this survival is like crosses 98% and 1 year survival crosses 89%. So the minimum resection, minimum loss of lung parenchyma, better is the outcome. What are the risk factors? First thing is ASA class of the patient. If it is belonging to class 3 or more, age more than 75 years, history of smoking, high BMI, presence of COPD, and one should remember that most of the patients will have a history of smoking and COPD in common. And the literature suggests that 75% of the diagnosed patients will have both COPD and lung cancer. So if the patient is coming for pneumonectomy for carcinoma lung, you have to deal with the problems of COPD also along with that. So double issues. So most common indication for which the patient comes for pneumonectomy is bronchogenic carcinoma, where the anatomical lesion is not amenable to alternate resection, as I suggested earlier, that lobectomy is not possible. And this happens when the tumor is arising from mainstem bronchus, proximal to bronchus intermedius, or tumors which are having involvement of lung hilum. Then other non-malignant diseases like traumatic injury of the lung with uncontrolled hemorrhage, which has got a potential to spill to the other lung, and it can damage both the lungs. Before that, one lung needs to be controlled, or the hemorrhage needs to be controlled. And chronic infective disorders like tuberculosis or fungal infections, which have got considerable lung destruction. So in those patients, the pneumonectomy is performed. The best assessment of respiratory function comes from the detailed history of patient's quality of life. It can give you a detailed idea how the patient would have the quality of life, how much his meds are. And baseline simple spirometry, if done preoperatively, can also give you a valuable information. Then objective measures are done for the pulmonary function assessment. That provides the information in a format which can be easily transmitted between the members of the healthcare team. So that is important. So the respiratory functions can be divided into 3 related but independent areas. One is respiratory mechanics, second is gaseous exchange, and third is cardiorespiratory interactions. So first thing is respiratory mechanics. So most important and simple test is forced expiratory volume in 1 second, or FEV1. Then second is forced vital capacity, and then third is maximum voluntary ventilation, and then residual volume to total lung capacity ratio. And these values are usually expressed whenever you performed a PFT. Then they are presented with respect to the patient's age, gender, height, and weight. And most valid single test for post-thoracotomy respiratory complications is predicted postoperative FEV1, commonly known as PPO FEV1. So how do we predict the postoperative FEV1? So we should know the normal anatomy and physiology. Like we have got 42 total subsegments of the lung. Right upper lobe has 6, right middle lobe has 4, and right lower lobe has 12. And on the left side, upper and lower lobe each has got 10. So if we are going to remove right lower lobe, then how to calculate the postoperative FEV1 decrease will be 12/42. That is 29% reduction will be there in the FEV1. That's how we can calculate and we can predict the postoperative FEV1. And based on this predicted postoperative FEV1, if it is more than 40%, then the patient is considered a low risk. And these patients, most of them can be safely extubated in the operating room if they fulfill the other criteria. If they are less than 30%, then they are high risk and they should be planned for staged weaning from mechanical ventilation. They should be shifted to ICU. And in these patients, you have to be very careful. And then if the post-operative FEV1 predicted one is between 30 to 40%, then these are borderline cases, and in which in these patients, the decision has to be taken based on the other parameters like exercise tolerance and diffusion capacity of the lung for carbon monoxide and ventilation perfusion scan. Then second category of tests are lung parenchymal functions. Lung parenchymal functions is basically the ability of the lung parenchyma to gaseous exchange, that is exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen from the pulmonary vasculature. So ABG preoperatively can give you a valuable information in the form of PaCO2 and PaO2. And other thing is diffusion capacity of the lung for carbon monoxide. So DLCO correlates with the total functioning surface area of the alveolus and capillary interface. And thus, the way we predicted FEV1, in the similar manner, DLCO can also be predicted. And if the DLCO is less than 40%, then it correlates with the increased risk of respiratory complications. And one should also remember that if the patient has received preoperative chemotherapy, then he's going to have further negative effect on the DLCO. So he's going to have a reduced DLCO. So preoperative chemotherapy, you have to specially subject these patients for various kinds of pulmonary function tests. Then the final and the third important group of respiratory function is the assessment of cardiopulmonary interaction. This cardiopulmonary interaction can be done with in the form of formal laboratory exercise testing, or as I said, with the clinical parameters. So maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, is derived by these laboratory testing, and it is the most useful predictor. And the risk of morbidity and mortality is high if the preoperative VO2 max is less than 15, and it is considered a contraindication to pneumonectomy if it is less than 10 ml per kg per minute. So how do this maximal oxygen consumption is calculated? This is calculated by cardiopulmonary exercise testing, or commonly known as CPET. This CPET is can be done either with a cycle ergometer, or commonly it is done with a treadmill. And we can calculate peak oxygen consumption and anaerobic threshold. These are the two important parameters that we derived from the cardiopulmonary exercise testing. And what are the indications of doing CPET? First thing is to evaluate the dyspnea. So why it is important? Because we are able to distinguish the cardiac from pulmonary from peripheral limitations of dyspnea. And then detection of exercise-induced bronchoconstriction can be done, and detection of exertional desaturation. If the patient desaturates during exercise, he is a high risk for pneumonectomy surgery. So these are the other indications like preoperative evaluation and risk stratification, prognostication of life expectancy, disability determination, and so on. So if the VO2 max is more than 15 ml, it is a good physiological function. And if it is more than 20, the patients can be safely subjected to pneumonectomy. But if it is less than 10 ml per kg per minute, it is usually regarded a contraindication. So one should remember as an MD student these values, because examiners would be interested to know what is the post-operative FEV1. You can safely conduct the pneumonectomy surgery. What is the VO2 max values? So one should remember all these things. So as I said, if you are not able to perform cardiopulmonary exercise testing, then you can do a 6-minute walk test that can correlate with the VO2 max. If the VO2 max, if the distance of 6-minute walk test in the meters if divided by 30, that can give you a value of the VO2 max. So if the CPAT is not available, you can ask the patient to walk for 6 minutes, calculate that, measure that distance in meters and divide it by 30. That will give you a VO2 max value. And then decrease of oxygen saturation more than 4% during exercise is also considered a risk factor for pneumonectomy. Traditional exercise testing in the ambulatory patient is stair climbing. If the person is able to climb 5 flights of stairs, it correlates with the VO2 max of more than 20. So remember this, 5 flights of stairs, 20 ml per kg per minute. 2 flights of stairs corresponds to 12 ml per kg per minute. And then right ventricular dysfunction is also associated with these patients, which is also contributing to the pulmonary vasculature problems. So if there is a clinical evidence of the hemodynamic problems in the patient, then this patient should be subjected to transesophageal echo and evaluate for the right ventricular dysfunction in this patient. Then last investigation is ventilation perfusion scintigraphy, or commonly known as VQ scan. So if the lung region to be resected is non-functioning or minimally functioning, that can be identified by VQ scanning. So it gives you an idea, like if you are going to, if that lung segment is not functioning, then you know that this is not contributing to the functional capacity of the patient, and this can be safely removed. So this gives you an idea. And if the VQ scan should be considered in those patients who have got a preoperative FEV1 less than 80%. So this will give you a valuable information. So whenever you are going to assess a patient in a holistic manner, then no single respiratory function will give you a valid preoperative assessment. You have to have a battery of tests, and from all the 3 category of investigations like lung mechanics, parenchymal function, and cardiopulmonary interaction. And these 3 aspects, they form the 3-legged stool in the foundation of respiratory assessment. Then other concomitant medical conditions, they also have a profound effect on the perioperative management of these patients. Frequently, cardiac diseases are commonly associated with these patients, and this is second most common cause of perioperative morbidity and mortality in the thoracic surgical population after the pulmonary complications. So majority of the pulmonary resection patients would have a smoking history as a risk factor, and pulmonary resection itself is an intermediate risk procedure in the terms of perioperative cardiac risk factors. So incidence of post-thoracotomy ischemia is 5%, which peaks on 2nd and 3rd post-operative day. So in all these patients, standard history, physical examination, and ECG should be a routine screening test for all patients in pre-thoracotomy period. Non-invasive testing should be done in those patients who have got major clinical predictors for myocardial ischemia like unstable angina, recent MI, severe valvular heart disease, or significant arrhythmias. And they should be therapeutically optimized in the form of medical therapy or coronary angioplasty or CABG surgery. Timing of lung resection after myocardial infarction is always debatable. Delay of 4 to 6 weeks in a medically stable patient who is fully investigated and optimized is acceptable. After a coronary stenting with a bare metal stent, 4 to 6 weeks delay. And if the drug-eluting stent has been put, a minimum of 6 months delay is required. Then arrhythmias are also common with pulmonary resection surgeries. They occur in 30 to 50% of the patients, especially in the first week post-operatively. And incidence of atrial fibrillation is the highest. And they correlate with the extent of lung resection and intraoperative blood loss. And so these patients can be treated with a preoperatively putting these patients on various drugs like digoxin, other atrial antiarrhythmics like beta blockers, verapamil, diltiazem, or amiodarone. Then age-related factors. If the patients belonging to higher age group, then the risk of respiratory complications are going to be double as compared to younger population. And risk of cardiac complications become triple than the younger population. So if the patient is elderly, then you are going to be more careful. Post-operative outcome among older patient after lobectomy is more acceptable than the pneumonectomy. So as a proportion of all lung cancer resections, pneumonectomy has decreased to approximately 1/3 as it was used to be done 15 years ago. And in older patients, as a minimum cardiac investigation, transthoracic echocardiography should be done to rule out pulmonary hypertension. So look for the PRVSP, look for the pulmonary hypertension and RV dysfunction in these patients. This will have an independent risk factor for the post-operative outcome of these patients. Then what is the physiology of one lung ventilation when we are putting these patients under anesthesia? So one lung ventilation, the patient is put in the lateral position with the lung which is going to be performing, on which the surgery is going to be performed would be in the non-dependent position, and the other ventilated lung will be in the dependent position. So perfusion to the dependent lung will be increased because of the effect of the gravity, and it will cause VQ matching in a dependent lung because of the adequate oxygenation till the patient is awake and breathing spontaneously. But as soon as you anesthetize the patient, the mediastinal shift will cause circulatory and the reflex changes similar to that of the tension pneumothorax, because there is a downward mediastinal shift of the non-dependent lung in the non-dependent hemithorax. And also the compliance is reduced. So if we see the pressure volume loop, the compliance of the non-dependent lung will be shifted from this position to this position, and that is one step down, and as well as the dependent lung would also come down on the compliance curve. So because the induction of anesthesia causes loss in the lung volume in both the lungs, thereby reducing the compliance. So the anesthetized patients in the lateral decubitus position would have less tidal ventilation in the dependent lung, where there is more perfusion. Thereby, there is a natural shunting of the blood without getting oxygenated. So it is producing a kind of shunt. That's why you get a problem when oxygenating the patients or removal of CO2 during one lung ventilation. So I want to give you one concept of hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. This is a normal physiological response to hypoxemia, and it is because of a reflex contraction of the vascular smooth muscles in the pulmonary vasculature in response to low partial pressure of oxygen. So because of this protective physiological mechanism, the one lung ventilation is possible. So if HPV is not there, it will not be possible to perform one lung ventilation, because it is a protective mechanism which diverts the blood flow away from the hypoxic areas to the lungs, to the areas which have got a better oxygenation. So as you are able to maintain the oxygenation as well as normal CO2 during one lung ventilation. So you have to avoid all those factors which reduce the HPV, and all the volatile anesthetics at a MAC value of more than 1, they inhibit HPV, and IV anesthetics have got a little effect on hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. That's why The IV anesthetics like propofol are preferred to maintain anesthesia during one lung ventilation. Then there is a biphasic nature of hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. There is rapid onset, which phase which is lasting for 20 to 30 minutes. And then there is a delayed phase which starts after 40 minutes and plateaus at 2 hours. And offset also occurs in a biphasic manner when you discontinue one lung ventilation. So major problem comes during one lung ventilation is when you are unable to maintain saturation of the patient. So how to improve oxygenation when there is a problem of low SpO2? First thing is to perform a recruitment maneuver to lungs, ventilate with 100% oxygen, then apply a little PEEP of 8 to 10 centimeters to the ventilated lung. PEEP will raise the end expiratory volume of the ventilated lung to near the FRC, and thereby you will be able to achieve oxygenation. And then you can put CPAP to the non-ventilated or collapsed lung, and it can be easily applied through a double lumen tube or a suction channel of a bronchial blocker. Then in extreme circumstances, you can ask the surgeon to directly compress the blood flow to the pulmonary artery of a non-ventilated lung if the surgeon has got the access. This will divert the blood flow to the ventilated lung and you will have improvement in the oxygenation. But this is rarely required and sometimes it is not possible also, but if it is possible, you should remember this. And then PA catheter, if can be positioned in the pulmonary artery and balloon can be inflated at the induction of the anesthesia, and it can also be used to block the blood flow to the pulmonary artery, but this is rarely required. But in the textbook, the technique has been described. Then how to perform the collapse and positioning of the patient. So the one thing one should remember is whenever you are going to initiate the one lung ventilation, don't before collapse of the lung, don't ventilate with 100% oxygen. Denitrogenate the patient with operative lung with 100% oxygen, because if you will ventilate with the air, it will have got a low blood gas solubility and it will delay the collapse. So if you ventilate with 100% oxygen, then it will facilitate the collapse of the lung on which the surgery is going to be performed, and you will have less problems with the surgical team complaining again and again that the lung is not collapsed. So ventilate with 100% oxygen before starting collapse. Then patient positioning, always recheck the position of the DLT or a bronchial blocker after the patient has been positioned. And we should remember the various injuries which can happen during positioning. In the dependent arm, basically compression injuries. In the non-dependent arm, stretch injuries are common. And hypotension can occur when you put the patient in lateral position because of the loss of the vascular tone. Then comes the various techniques. This is the most important aspect of the one lung ventilation, because if you are not familiar with the techniques and the gadgets, you will not be able to achieve one lung ventilation. So mechanical separation of the two lung is needed to allow one lung to ventilate, and while the other lung is being compressed by the surgeon and allowed to passively deflate and perform the surgery. This is an important prerequisite. Indications of one lung ventilation. Absolute indications are to avoid the spillage or contamination whenever there is an infection or massive hemorrhage, or for the control of distribution of ventilation like bronchopleural or bronchocutaneous fistula, surgical opening of a major conducting airway, or if there is a giant unilateral lung cyst or bulla is present. And then if there is a unilateral bronchopulmonary lavage has to be performed. Relative indications are those surgical exposures which are of high priority, like thoracic aortic aneurysm, pneumonectomies and upper lobectomies, and surgical exposures with low priority are esophageal surgery and minimally invasive cardiac surgery like mid-cap. Contraindication for one lung ventilation is if the patient is dependent on both the lungs for mechanical ventilation, or if there is an intraluminal airway mass that is restricting the access to tracheobronchial tree. So to achieve lung isolation, one has to know the tracheobronchial anatomy of the patient. So always try to review the imaging like chest x-rays and the CT scans, which otherwise would also be done by the surgical team. You don't need to order them separately, but just review the various imaging which the surgeon has obtained and you will understand the tracheobronchial anatomy. And whenever possible, use the fiber optic bronchoscopy. Various anatomical facts one should know, which will be helpful in positioning the DLT and bronchial blockers. First thing is that all of us know that right main stem bronchus is shorter, straighter, wider than as compared to the left. Origin of the carina is at an angle of 25 degrees, and while at the left main stem bronchus, it is 45 degrees. And the right upper lobe bronchus takes off very quickly after the origin of the right main stem bronchus. And in many patients, you have got a very short right main stem bronchus. And it is usually easier to intubate the right main stem bronchus than left. But it is very easy also to obstruct the upper lobe bronchus also. Because you can see that right upper lobe, right main stem bronchus, it is so short and it is got more in line with the trachea. So it is easier to intubate. But the thing is that you can easily block the right upper lobe of the right lung. So you will further obstruct the floor. So that's why the right sided DLTs are less preferred as compared to left sided DLTs, because the margin of safety is more in the left main stem bronchus, is because the left main stem bronchus is more long and the origin of the upper lobe bronchus is after a considerable distance. Then various methods, most common are double lumen tubes. Now the availability of bronchial blockers has also increased. Various companies have launched their blockers in the market and we are using quite a few of them. And then in the pediatric patients, when these things are not available, then you can usually advance the single lumen endotracheal tube to achieve one lung ventilation, or you can use a balloon tipped catheter like Fogarty or other things. I'll tell you about the double lumen tubes now. They are designated. Basically, these are two single lumen tubes which are bonded together and they are designated as left or right. The various types which were used earlier were the Carlens and Robert Shaw. In Carlens, it was a presence of carinal hook that was the distinguishing feature. And in the Robert Shaw, it is a D-shaped lumen and without the presence of carinal hook. But nowadays, we are using mostly the disposable DLTs, which are made up of PVC. The other improvements in the design of the DLT is the radiological marker, which has been placed near the endobronchial or endotracheal cuffs. And these disposable tubes are supplied with a stellate, connector, suction catheter, and sometimes even a means to supply a CPAP to a non-ventilated lung. So these are coming in a comprehensive package and they are easier to use. Important thing to remember is resting volume and the compliance of the bronchial cuff varies between the various DLTs and the brands. Blue marking on the pilot balloon is for the bronchial cuff, and bronchial cuff for the right-sided tube is again variable in shape. Sometimes it gives you an entry hole for the right upper lobe bronchus also. Fewer DLTs now have got a carinal hook, but it was there earlier, which was helpful in proper placement and minimizing the tube movement. And as I said earlier, right-sided DLTs have got a modified slot for the ventilation of the right upper lobe bronchus. This is also asked in the practicals as well as in the theory, how to select the size of the DLT. So in general, a largest DLT that can be atraumatically introduced into the bronchus should be chosen. Adult DLTs are coming in the size of 35, 37, 39, and 41 French. While for the younger patients, they are also available in 26, 28, and 32 sizes. the outermost acceptable position of the left-sided DLT is the bronchial cuff. It should be just below the level of the carina. And right-sided DLT tube, it is acceptable when there is a upper lobe ventilation is possible with the right upper lobe orifice. There is no absolute accurate method for selecting the correct size tube. Age, gender, height, and weight are poor predictors. Direct measurement of the bronchial width by imaging is a good method, and diameter of the left mainstem bronchus is directly proportional to the tracheal width. So if you are able to measure the tracheal diameter, you can easily measure or calculate the left bronchial width. So this is the formula for the measurement of the left bronchial width. It is 0.45 into tracheal width in millimeter on chest X-ray plus 3.3. So that should be the size of the or the diameter of the left mainstem bronchus. And then this is a rough estimate based on the height and the gender. Female patients less than 160 centimeters, 35 size tube. More than 160 centimeters, 37 French tube. Male patient less than 170 centimeters, 39 French, and male more than 170 centimeters, 41. And depth of insertion is equal to 12 plus patient side divided by 10. So these are the various formulas. Tube choice, right versus left. As far as incidence and severity of complications are concerned, they are the same. Right-sided DLTs, right-sided surgery, left-side DLT should be used. During left lung surgeries, whenever possible, again use left-sided DLT. Right-sided DLT should be used whenever it is important to avoid left-sided manipulations, like if there is a distorted anatomy of the entrance of the left mainstem bronchus, like external or intraluminal tumor compressions, descending thoracic aortic aneurysm, or size of the site of the surgeries involving the left mainstem bronchus, like left lung transplant, left tracheobronchial disruption is there. The surgeon has to perform left pneumonectomy or left-sided sleeve resection. So in most of the cases, preferred size, type is left-sided DLT. Placement, it's basically a practical topic. I can just tell you one point is that when introducing the DLT, the distal curve, that is the bronchial curve, is facing anteriorly. And once you have advanced it through the glottis, you rotate it to the 90 degrees to the side of the tube in which you are going to insert. Like left DLT, you rotate it 90 degrees and advance it till you feel a resistance. And then inflate the bronchial and tracheal cuffs, and then ventilate both the lungs separately and check. And if you have to check the position, introduce the fiber optic bronchoscope through the tracheal lumen, not through the bronchial lumen. It is better to advance it through the tracheal lumen, where you can visualize the carina, and then you can easily see on which side of the left or the right the bronchial lumen of the or the bronchial portion of the DLT has gone in. So fiber optic bronchoscope is the most accurate method to guide double lumen tube. More time is required. You need to be familiar with the gadget, and one should not overinflate the bronchial cuff. Overinflation may cause herniation of the cuff into the trachea or the bronchial segment and can obstruct the ventilation. Confirmation, I told you. Then problems that are there with the DLTs are size selection. They are unsuitable in difficult airway situation. They are not optimal for post-operative ventilation. So one has to change it to single lumen tube, malpositioning during the surgery, and airway trauma. So the second type of gadgets after DLT are the bronchial blockers. So bronchial blockers, if they are enclosed with a modified single lumen tube, they are known as univent tubes. And then bronchial blockers which are coming independently, they are of 4 types: Arndt bronchial blockers, Cohen bronchial blocker, Fusey, and Easy blocker. So this is the univent tube. You can see this is a single lumen tube, and then there is a bronchial blocker. It can extend 8 to 10 centimeters beyond the tip of the endotracheal tube, and it can provide isolation, lung isolation on whichever side you want to block, you can do easily. And then you can put CPAP or gent ventilation or oxygen or suction can be applied through the central lumen. Problems with this is they are of fixed shape and there is an incidence of bronchial rupture with the balloon. Then second is a most common bronchial blocker is Arndt bronchial blockers. It was invented by Dr. Arndt, who himself is an anesthesiologist, and they are available in 3 sizes, 5, 7, and 9 French, and 2 lengths, 65 and 78 centimeters. There are side holes at the distal end for the deflation, and they have got a high volume, low pressure balloon, which is spherical or elliptical in shape. And then inner lumen contains nylon wire, and which can be passed through the bronchoscope. You can see this is a nylon wire and it can be entangled with the tip of the fiber optic bronchoscope and it can be advanced into the desired left main or right main stem bronchus, depending upon the site of blockage. Then second bronchial blocker is a Cohen tip deflecting bronchial blocker, which is similar to Arndt. It comes with a 9 French size and 65 centimeters length. It has got a high volume and low pressure cuff. Side holes are there between the tip and the balloon to evacuate the gas. And there is a proximal control wheel to adjust the tip deflection. You can see that the distal tip is pre-angled and there is a torque grip at 55 centimeters mark, which allows for the rotation. And you can rotate to the left or to the right and then advance it to block the particular bronchial blocker. And then you can check through the fiber optic bronchoscope what is the position. Then third is a Fuji uni blocker. It is again an independent blocker. It has got a high volume balloon made up of silicon and which has got a gas barrier property to reduce the diffusion of the gases into and out of the cuff. So during prolonged one lung ventilation, the cuff pressure will not change. There is a fixed distal hockey stick angulation to facilitate the insertion. So you can see this is a Fuji uni blocker. And then last and the most recent is a Easy blocker, which is a Y-shaped distal bronchial blocker, and it is available in the 7 French size. It has got a Y-shaped bifurcation and it can be inserted only with the endotracheal tube of more than 8. This end of the Y sits on the tracheal carina, and then you can inflate the balloon and you can block either of the main stem bronchi. Other methods, I told you earlier itself, in pediatric population, you cannot use double lumen tubes or bronchial blockers. Then you can use Fogarty catheter or Foley's catheter or Swan-Ganj catheter, especially in the children less than 10 kg body weight. And if there is an endobronchial intubation, it can be performed with the advancement of single lumen endotracheal tube also. Problems with the bronchial blockers are when inflated, they may dislodge above the carina. They can cause hypoxemia, airway injury, and may move during the surgical procedure. The various pros and cons between the DLTs and the bronchial blockers. We can easily achieve 2 lung ventilation with both of them. Then independent lung ventilation is possible with DLT, whereas with bronchial blockers, it's not possible. And then either lung can be recruited separately. If you are using bronchial blocker, collapsed lung cannot be recruited separately. And it needs to be replaced by DLT needs to be replaced by single lumen tube at the end of the surgery. This is a major disadvantage. And whereas bronchial blockers, you can simply pull it out and the single lumen endotracheal tube, which is there, will remain inside. Then few words about the postoperative management. I already described this slide, and if the preoperative FEV1, which is predicted for the postoperative period, is the major predictor for the outcome of the patient. If it is more than 40%, the patients are going to have a good outcome, and if it is less than 30%, they will have a poor outcome. Postoperative pain control is extremely important, and it can be delivered with various techniques, including epidural analgesia, paravertebral block, erector spinae block. Various techniques now have been used, especially one has to use multimodal analgesia to give adequate pain control. Various post-operative complications, one has to remember acute CO2 retention in the post-operative period, prolonged mechanical ventilation, infections, atelectasis, bronchospasm, pulmonary embolism, cardiac arrhythmias, MI, and post-operative mortality. These are the various things that can be there in one can expect in the post-operative period. I think I have covered most of the major areas, and if there are any questions or comments, I will be happy to answer them.